I'm Kevin Davis, and this is the Catholic Family Podcast. I'm joined by a good friend by now. This is Mr. Griff Ruby, and we have been talking for a while now, as I'm sure most people know, about Sedevacantism. He's written several books on the topic, and today we're not gonna go to part 4 just yet, because we're gonna take a bit of a step backwards, or not backward. We're gonna take a small step forward and do part, let's say, 3.5, because it's talking about a really interesting question. We're going to kind of step away from his book for the moment. We're going to take over his book again in part 4 of this series. So part 3.5, we're going to talk about a really important question. It's one that I've seen very often in the last few days, especially over Twitter. There's been and I don't think you're on Twitter, Mr. Ruby, but there's been a full-on Sedevacantists versus R&R war on Twitter the last few days. It's been really intense. And one of the biggest questions that's come up, I'm really glad you bring this up, kind of without having known the Twitter war, is the question being, what exactly is the Vatican II church or congregation or whatever we want to call it? And that's what we want to talk about. And I think I would love to hear your opinion or how you want to start. Maybe you want to ask me a question. Where do we go with this?
Okay, well, thank you for reaching out to me in my temporary vacation from my normal haunts. So if you notice the unfamiliar background, that's why.
You look pretty casual too. It's good. I appreciate
it.
Well,
yeah, it's the time to visit my. It's the time to visit my wife's relatives, and so I'm there. So anyway, yeah, I mean, I focus so much on, where the church is and, also where the church isn't, I mean, it's easy to see where it is. Look at those guys. They're not Catholics. I mean, there is a lot more one could go into, but it seems like, well, that's enough, isn't it? Well, it's all the theology that, goes into it that I have in my volumes. Okay, but I also like to stress, where then is the church? I say what I say. Some people seem to like it. Some people don't. But that's what I came up with as I was looking at kind of some of the responses to how things went last week. And even just kind of something you kind of mentioned that made me kind of realize there's we need to take a little side diversion to this other kind of a question. It's not really a side diversion. Indeed, actually, some of it does receive some discussion in my books, but it's kind of a different subject that I don't usually get around to covering. And it allows us to answer the good question, what exactly is the Vatican organization as a society? Is it a true church? Is it a false church? Is it some weird mixture of the two? Or might it be something completely else? So, so I'm throwing it out, if you don't mind, but we prepared this a little bit in advance. As you know, I'll be throwing this back out to you. What would be A, your own thoughts on that kind of question, and then also B, what other ideas have you seen out there? You mentioned there's some sort of a bunch of discussion on Twitter going on, so there's probably at least two or three basic opinions going on there. So let's just kind of give me a sense of what the world is saying.
Yeah, I mean, in the topic right now, I'd say it's been a big question from the R&R folks saying, okay, if you're Sedevacantist since 1958, since when? I mean, when did this break happen? When is the official break of saying the church was the church and then it was no longer the church? They went and formed their own organization or their own society or whatever. And since it's kind of debated among Sedevacantists or unknown, really, some people will say 1958, some people will say right, exactly.
I mean, obviously, if you resist but recognize, you think it's simply still the church, just in a very, very, very bad state.
Right.
But you still think it's in some way the church in a very un-Catholic mode. But even if you're Catholic, you're still saying that you assume they have a legal continuity, as if they didn't stop being the church. So that's why you still, if you're that mindset, would look to them to provide us with a pope, look to them to provide all the canonical structure and so forth and so on. But, and yet that's obviously there are other thoughts. Maybe we'll start with yours, and then you could talk about the others just a little.
Right. So like Bishop Sanborn, I think he has said that. I think in the podcast he did with me that when he looked into it, he felt like they're not the same. The Novus Ordo church or congregation society is not the same as Protestant, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim. They have a different place. They are wrong. They are not Catholic, but they are also not equal to the others. I think that basically paraphrasing what he believed. Now, for me, yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a really important one. Is who are members of the church and people in the Novus Ordo who are honestly striving to be Catholic and think that it is the Catholic faith because, well, they say it is. It literally has the name. They have the man called the Pope. They have the cardinals called the cardinals, etc. And so I can see why someone would be tricked into that. Now, clearly, these people haven't looked into the past, the history of the church, and that's a different issue. But does it mean they're members if they're really trying, or could they potentially be saved because of invincible ignorance? And I haven't done research into it. I honestly couldn't tell you. I think they're wrong. So I do think that they're members of a false church. But is it the same as members of a Protestant religion? I would say no. I think it almost can't be. But it's a great question. I don't honestly have an answer for you.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's been a toughie. Well, why don't I just get right and stop beating around the bush? Why don't I tell you what I believe what the Vatican organization is? Well, I was starting to introduce this subject when I talk about the separation of the church being a perfect society. Now, when you read about in the manuals where they talk about the church as a perfect society, there's about two basic examples. One, by far the most common, is the relationship between church and state. And I was just, I was looking at another manual of canon law by Ramstein, by the way. I was just starting to read that. It's kind of an interesting book. But at any rate, it's really neat how it explains that canon law really, being directly from God is actually superior to civil law. So it's not completely independent because you got some areas that are mixed. And basically, it was up to the side of canon law and the church to delineate what areas properly belong to the church and what areas do not. So if, let's say, a parting of the ways between a man and woman comes because maybe their marriage they thought they had to be annulled, the woman's previous husband thought to be deceased comes back, resurfaces alive and well, or something like that. Well, obviously, whatever marriage she had isn't there anymore. So you have an annulment. Now, it's up to the church to say that there's an annulment or there's still a marriage, but it's up to the civil authority to decide how property, et cetera, is to be divvied up and things of that nature. So, that would be a perfect example of a very mixed example. But there's one other case that came up in Father Sylvester Berry's book, where the other place the perfect society gets discussed is the relationship between the church and the synagogue. So now we have really two separate entities here that the church has been contrasted with as distinct entities with which the church has a relationship. Now I'm about to introduce a third, but actually we have already. It's the Vatican organization taken as a whole, with everything in it, good, bad, or indifferent that it's got, at any point in time, even to today. So if you take that as a whole, I believe it is, as a whole society, it is not a church, either true or false. It is a society, basically on par with a secular nation, sort of like, or I guess you could even, instead of just an individual or particular nation, a fourth example would be, say, some sort of a paranation, such as, say, the United Nations or something. You see, all of these different kinds of things, they're made by men, they're created by men or women, whatever, by humans, but they are societies that don't of themselves pertain to anything of God. They don't have any real responsibility for the divine things. And so it is, in effect, a secular society more comparable to almost anything else, either a secular nation or the Jewish synagogue. So when you view it in that sense, let's take the example of some Middle Eastern place, an Islamic nation, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, whatever, okay? There is a nation It is a secular power. People are citizens of that, live there. Sometimes some of their citizens live abroad, but they're citizens of that nation. Not all citizens, it is an Islamic nation, but not all citizens of that nation are Muslims. Most are, all the important ones are as far as their political process, but there's a small contingent of non-Muslims in their nation. They might be second-class citizens. They might be treated like dirt. They might be grudgingly tolerated, but they are permitted in existence as citizens in their nation. And as such, being a citizen of Saudi Arabia would not mean I am personally a Muslim. I could be one of those Christians or Jews or various other non-Muslims that would generally have to live in small, isolated communities that would have a history of, let's say you have a sultan and he's at war with a neighboring sultan and he's losing. Then he says to the non-Muslims in his area, if you help me, I will grant you some formal recognition, legal recognition. I won't force you to be Muslims, but you can worship freely. You may have to stay in your towns if you're going to do anything religious, but I'm going to grant you some real freedoms and so forth if you fight and help me win this war. And they do, and they win, and he's an honorable man, this sultan, whoever he is, and they get some position where they are now allowed to be real citizens of the nation without having to be Muslims. And these situations get created, and some of these still exist to this day. Many Islamic nations have these places. Now, they'll kind of put a wall around them in a process that we sometimes hear dehimitude, Dhimitude. Okay, dehimitude, which is just like it's kind of a separation. They're part of us legally as fellow citizens of the nation, whatever it is, but we don't count them as our brothers because they're not Muslims, they're whatever else.
So you'd be saying that someone could be a Catholic despite being a member of the Novus Ordo?
Well, first of all, in the beginning, that would absolutely have to have been the case.
Right.
So, because otherwise, if it stays a church, let's say if it transitioned directly from a true church to a false church at some point, it doesn't matter where you draw the line, it would mean that every Catholic, or virtually every Catholic, I mean, how would anybody be a Catholic if they're not in there? The only things I could think of would be some isolated group that has no contact with the rest of the world, stranded on a desert island or whatever, or alternatively, maybe if some cleric were unjustly excommunicated, but maybe still functioning somewhere in some limited capacity anyway, such that they're not members officially because they've either been cut off and don't know physically, not cut off spiritually, but just cut off physically, that no one even knows if they're alive or not, or else cut off by, say, an unjust excommunication where there's nothing that anybody did wrong here on this side, but on the side of the cleric or whatever individuals remain attached to that cleric. But at the same time, they're not counted as part because, excommunication, you have no business having a ministry at all, but let's say they do have at least something going on anyway. So now, that could be about the only way you would have had anybody. But I don't know of any specific situations of either of those scenarios that were operative at any period of time from, say, the death of Pope Pius XII to, let's say, the promulgation of the Novus Ordo ceremony.
Right.
So, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means I don't know of any. That seems to be as hard to find as the idea that maybe somewhere there's still a faithful bishop in some forgotten corner of the world or something. Bishop in the woods notion. So basically, you have a whole society that would have gone from being the church, which you are morally required to be a member of if you understand your responsibilities as a soul before God, who has sought God, who has been baptized into the church. You understand you have an obligation to belong to that society, to suddenly becoming a false church, which, being a false church, you have a moral obligation to not be a member of it. Right. And right there, until you have some Catholics leaving and kind of regrouping, as it were, however long, you in effect have no church at all. So if it turned itself into a false church in one single step, that cannot have happened. So we're not dealing with a true or false church. Now, one of the things that came out of my study of the whole subsistence thing in the Lumen Gentium, if you don't mind me borrowing a little bit from my second volume,
of course,
was the idea of what does it mean to say that a given society subsists in another society? Well, first of all, just the bare fact of in is a direct and unmistakable and explicit implication that you are now dealing with two separate and distinct societies. You have the church that does its subsisting. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with subsistence. That just refers to the fact that the world exists, that the church exists eternally. It perdures. It has an existence that isn't just that it's around, but it has a permanent intrinsic existence that, sort of like God himself, cannot be brought to an end by any merely human agency. So that's all that means, but it's the word that comes after. You see, you could put a different word after instead of in, and you would have very different effects depending on what you put there. Suppose instead it had said subsist throughout. That would have been a difference. And that would have implied that all of them would have to be of the church, plus there could be other Catholics that are not of them. Or if you said subsist as the church. And how do we illustrate this? Okay. I realized at some point that the Catholic Church subsists in the United States of America. It subsists in Germany. It subsists in Brazil, Bolivia. Heck, you might even find it in, find a little bit of it in, Red China and Saudi Arabia and Yemen and, Jordan and Syria and all these other kinds of places. Insofar as there's any Catholics, just any Catholic, that's the church, a piece of the church, and the church has the subsistent quality to it, which doesn't guarantee that every part must necessarily always survive every circumstance, but that the church as a whole has this quality that it will always survive, and that quality extends to it all, even though it doesn't mean that it all would be, totally, indestructible. Each person, each part, because of course you could theoretically, I suppose, have some nation where its ruler, says to the Catholics, all of you must leave this country or we put you to death. And then anybody who doesn't leave is put to death and there's no Catholics left. And you could say, well, I don't think the church is subsisting there anymore, but it doesn't mean we lose our subsistent quality in all places that we exist.
Right.
So anyway, if we subsist in these countries, which is absolutely, literally true, well, it's also said right there in Lumen Gentium that we subsist in the Vatican organization. Now, confusingly, they call it a Catholic Church. They don't call it the Roman Church or Roman Catholic, just Catholic. Little c, by the way. I don't know what to make of that. Some people could make something of that, but I just simply note that and go on, because that could just be an idiosyncrasy of the church or the Latin language or something of that sort. And I'm not going to dwell on that at all. But at any rate, to subsist in their society, that puts their society on exactly the same level as any other secular power. Now, as a secular power, they do, however, have a state religion. Let's go back to our Saudi Arabia illustration. Saudi Arabia is basically made up of Muslims, but as I described, there could be some non-Muslims, some of whom could be Catholics even, who could still be citizens. But it is a Muslim nation. It has a state religion. That is its state religion. The Vatican organization has a state religion, and the best thing to call that state religion is Novus Ordoism. And that state religion identifies itself by a whole different set of worship, of disciplines, of morals, of teachings, everything. It's a whole different alien religion to that of Catholicism. But that's the state religion of the Novus Ordo organization, the Vatican organization of today, as a society. So what that means is, even from the very beginning, when basically the church ended up separating off or duplicating really its secular, political, legal, canonical aspects into a separate society. That doesn't mean that the mystical body of Christ loses those qualities. We certainly do not. But it does mean that now you've got basically two sets of this thing in parallel as of, whatever moment this break took place.
And when would you say that moment took place then? Is there a...
Well, that's by Lumen Gentium. That's where I think it happened. But like I said, when we really want to get into book 2, I mean, that's what I want to talk about, what reasons I believe that is the moment. And I think by the time we get through it all, there's some very compelling reasons to believe it. Compelling, persuasive maybe, Are they yea, verily, that they can be confirmed by the church? That I have to leave to the church. But I mean, it certainly has a lot going for it. But let's put that back on the side for a moment. The point is, once you got these two separate things, a purely secular society with a state church that in the beginning looked the same as Catholics, but being a state church is now up to the state, that secular state, to decide what it's going to believe, what it's going to do, how it's going to worship. It's just like what happened in England, let's say. All those clerics signed the Declaration of Royal Supremacy. Now the king, or queen as the case may sometimes be, is their pope. They are not subject to the pope in Rome anymore. They're okay with the rest of the world being subject to the pope, but they now have their own pope, they have the king, and that's enough for them, or so they think. Now, what happens when you're cut off from that? It's up to the king or whoever he appoints to be in charge of the state religion, at that time, state religion of England, which up until that point, Catholicism was the state church of England. It was a Catholic nation. Now suddenly it is not really a Catholic nation, even though for the moment it is so Catholic that you could still say every ordinary parishioner is still a Catholic, and would remain so until either A, their religion changes enough that you'd have to say, this is not Catholic anymore, or B, at whatever point things are starting to change, you get an official edict from Rome saying, this church is in schism, they're going into heresy, and we hereby pronounce an interdict on anybody who continues to have anything with that church, that state church of England. We exist too there, however few we may be. And this is where Catholics must be, with the underground priests that, hidden in priests' holes in private houses and things like that. So that's where you get two different, religions, as it were, in the same house, because the house now is merely a secular government. So who's with the state religion and who's with the Catholic Church? Well, at first, there's probably so little difference, because you can't tell. Nothing's happened yet as far as, the liturgy is not as clearly, whatever changes that have happened in the liturgy are not beyond the pale. I mean, okay, they added the name of St. Joseph to the canon. That's even before Lumen Gentium, by the way. So whatever one may think of that, it can't be beyond the pale. It doesn't invalidate the Mass. It doesn't turn it into a non-Catholic Mass. But it is a beginning of a lot of other stuff. Well, not quite the beginning. There's stuff that they were already monkeying around with even before. But nothing that would take anything anywhere near beyond the pale. You can worship quite validly and Catholically with a 1962 Mass, or a 1955 Mass. And it doesn't really matter in terms of being a Catholic. I mean, I think there's more depth to the 1955 Mass. You have a lot more of the different subtle ceremonies. You have different things they do, such as Tenebrae and other, things that just kind of fell away and disappeared. But you still have an essentially Catholic, Mass, Catholic system of belief, Catholic catechisms, Catholic morality. All of that is entirely unaffected. But obviously, as we know, when you have a separation from the church, that does not last very long. Things start to change. They mutate because they can. Before they could not. bad people can pull in different directions, but they have very little real influence to do this. A corrupt priest would try to take his congregation in some strange direction, but it would only be a matter of time before the bishop comes back and jerks the chain and says, get back in line, or I kick you out and replace it with somebody who will get in line.
Right.
So you have that accountability. Now suddenly that accountability is gone. They wander off. Nobody says, hey, you can't do that. And especially if it's the king or queen who's wandering off, you can't just say, hey, you can't do that anymore, because they can say, why not? Sure you can.
Right.
So
I'm still here, sorry.
yeah, I'm not seeing you on my screen, but since I can hear you, thank you for reassuring me that way. It's kind of like, should I continue? Yeah, okay.
Keep going. You're good.
Okay, so here we are in the same kind of situation. The cutoff has happened, and then things lose that sense of control, that stability, that rock-like stability that St. Peter exists to give us, because they are no longer connected to the rock of St. Peter. So they wander off. Now, as they wander off, there are people who don't wander off. They stick with what they've known, what they've grown up with, what they've trained in, and for those who are clergy, what they were ordained in, or maybe even consecrated in. And there are those who just merrily go along with whatever it is. By this, one shows to what they belong and to whom they belong. So if you kept the church to the real church, what did you do? There weren't always indults and so forth, but there were a lot of priests and even some bishops who dragged their feet about going along with the new stuff. They wouldn't do any of it. They would just stick with what they knew. They might take some heat. Some of them might eventually be exiled from their natural, proper parish churches, which they have done no wrong, but are unjustly forced out, and they'll set up somewhere. By the way, the Father Bell I mentioned an episode or two ago was an example of one of these. He stuck to the Mass and the belief and everything that he had been raised, trained, and ordained in, and just continued to do it. And if he couldn't do it in a church, he'd do it in a rented room or whatever, until eventually, because of the motu proprio, basically one of the local Novus Ordo leaders wanting to accommodate the motu proprio, decided to let Father Bell, use their building for the Mass. So clearly, that man, even though he's a member of that society, one can question whether he was a member throughout the time officially all the way through, but he was always a member of the church. And that's why he's a real priest. That's why he did not lose his faculties at any point. That's why he had them until his death, because no one has the right to take them away from him. And B, he's always kept the faith consistently all the way throughout, no matter where he is or what he was doing or who he was, working with and so forth. So that makes him part of the church. So you have the foot draggers, I call them. Dragging the feet in hope is kind of the expression I use, which is kind of an ironic phrase, but that's exactly it. You're hoping that this madness will just pass over, and then after it's over, everyone will be saying, wow, how prudent you were not to go knocking down the main altar and putting in a table and smashing the stained glass windows and putting in something else. And then now that madness is over, we got to spend even more money, put all that stuff back in. How prudent of you! What a good manager! What a good steward you have been of the church's resources. They hoped that. They believed that would happen because they were not understanding the whole situation. They saw the alien direction. They knew they shouldn't go along with it. That's the passive infallibility of the church at work, by the way. The sheep know the voice of the true shepherd, and another voice they will not follow. And that's exactly it. Those were the sheep. And then the others who went along, they did follow the voice of the stranger, and that's what they were doing. So as things deviated, as elements of this new religion came to be developed, somewhat in Vatican II, and then continuing so afterwards, with most pointedly the new revised sacraments and the new catechisms. I mean, we always hear the Novus Ordo. We know the changes to the other sacraments we learn about, but there were other things like, I mean, you ever heard of the Dutch Catechism? You know, you should read. Archbishop Lefebvre's open letter to confused Catholics. He has a lot to say about the Dutch Catechism, and his points are very on point about that. And that really is a true measure of just how different a religion the Novus Ordo really is.
But let's say that your theory about the Novus Ordo being a society is true, which I think is a really interesting theory. What then? Give me some examples of what would decide that someone is a member of the false church rather than the true church, because that's the next question, right? So what's the difference? What is it? The Latin Mass? Is it the consecration and ordination?
I use primarily the Mass. I think that's really the one that makes the most sense, because the Mass is really where all the Catholics are. This is our profession of faith. Our profession of faith, as I think I mentioned at one other point a long time ago, isn't limited to just saying the creed. It actually extends the whole way that we worship as Catholics. All of that is our public profession of faith. What does it take to be a Catholic? You must be baptized. You must not have been excluded, either left yourself voluntarily or not been excluded by lawful authority. And you must profess the Catholic faith. If your Mass is the Catholic Mass, the traditional Mass, the Tridentine Rite for us Latins, or whatever the authentic Masses would be of the various other rites of the Church, in that Mass, you are professing the Catholic faith. When you go to the other one, the Novus Ordo ceremony, or whatever equivalent corruptions have been introduced in any of the other rites in much later years, in that you openly profess that your membership in a non-Catholic church.
Right.
So that's the point where I put that together. I think that makes the most sense. If somebody could come up with a better one, hey, I'm all ears. But that sounds pretty good, and I don't know that there's a need to come up with some better explanation. So
I mean,
have those.
I know that people would ask for it though, because I know that's, and I really like the theory because that answers part of the question, saying that it's, as a member, as a part of a society, that's where you get this gap. You bridge the gap, and that's a really important question. But then I really do think another important one is, okay, what is the difference then? And I think the Latin Mass makes sense, but it can't only be, because again, look at like the consecration ordinations. Are they valid or are they not? And if they're not, then they can't be offering the true Mass, right?
Well, you can't make a valid Mass, and that's a good point. But I'm really thinking, even if the Mass were invalid purely and strictly because the man doing it was never validly ordained a priest, but the ceremony still publicly professes the Catholic faith. But they're obviously, suppose just even in the good old days, somehow some bishop slipped up badly and messed something up so bad that somebody he thought and the church thought he ordained didn't really get validly ordained. It's a terrible thing to think about, and hopefully it's extremely rare, or maybe, but there could have been some handful of such instances throughout all of church history. What happened? Was that priest not a Catholic priest because, unbeknownst to him, he didn't actually get a valid ordination, and he went on and did all the priestly functions he should be doing as a priest, except he's not validly ordained and therefore really shouldn't be doing things, or not? It's really kind of comparable to that. Only now it's becoming systemic to the Vatican society. But not everyone was necessarily switching to the new ceremonies. There's a lot of people who assume, for example, that, oh goodness, his name fell out of my brain. Bishop Lazo in the Philippines was supposedly made a bishop in 1970. Well, by 1970, they're on to the new, consecration formula, which is even worse than, the priestly ordination was kind of ambiguous. It might or might not succeed in a given case. But the episcopal consecration is much more serious, that it really doesn't seem like there's a way for the Novus Ordo consecration to give you a real bishop. Now, I have seen where Monsignor Charles Journet and also Ludwig Ott each discussed the possibility that a man who has a valid priesthood but is not made to bishop might be able to ordain a man to the priesthood under various narrow and specific circumstances. So I'm not ready to say that if one of these non-bishops, but they would have all been real priests so far, because they have been made priests like years before when when they were valid, might have gone through the motions of trying to ordain somebody, and they're not a bishop, but they could still have taken. So, but that's a big subject that might be for another video, because there's a lot more to say about that. First, I need to dig up the quotes again and look at them directly. And second of all, how would that apply today? Because they require the Pope to basically order the person to ordain men to the priesthood, though he's only a priest himself. And how would you have that if you don't really have a real Pope? And that's another talk for another day. But at any rate, you're professing the faith if you are keeping the traditional forms. Now, what I'm thinking is with Bishop Lazoe, there's a real possibility, though, he might have been consecrated by the old formula. The old formula, remember, when they come out with the new formulas, they had to translate everything into the local vernaculars, to do everything in the vernacular. So how long would it have been before they had a Tagalog vernacular of the Episcopal consecration ceremony? Say nothing of, Philippines is a poor country. They just might not be able to afford new books for however long, so they just keep using the old ones until one way or another they'll get the new books, which could be months or even years after more wealthy nations like America or European nations close there to Rome physically would probably have gotten, in a matter of months or sooner. So there's a possibility that it could still have been per the old ceremony. It's just we couldn't be sure. So the SSPX, in their doubt, simply allowed him just to say mass for people. They didn't have him doing confirmations or ordinations because they weren't sure. So there's some of these kinds of things. It takes time for some of this stuff to ripple through it. It doesn't always just go bam like that, and the whole thing goes into into the garbage pit. So there would be that. Now, there was one other illustration. I talked about the nation, the secular nation. The other comparison, I think, also brings a little bit to the table, a little bit more, and that had to do with the relationship between the church and the synagogue. Because in the beginning, you see, you got Jesus and his original 12 disciples, and virtually all of their followers, some exceptions, the Roman centurion, who's obviously a pagan, but comes to him because he wants somebody healed, for example, things of that nature. So, but basically it was a Jewish thing. They were Jews. They went to the temple. They sacrificed animals and whatnot in the temple in accordance with the Mosaic law. They observed all the laws of the kashrut. They were kosher, in other words. So they were practicing Jews. And even thereafter, in Jerusalem, the congregation under St. James continued on as practicing kosher Jews. So you could be both a Jew and a Catholic simultaneously for a period of time. Now, there would come a time where the church would have to say, we can't do this anymore. Even if you've been circumcised, basically, you're going to have to, in whatever way you can, disown that. See your baptism as being a disowning of that, or disown it afresh for yourself in whatever way we come, like an abjuration kind of a thing, perhaps. I don't know what their exact mechanism was, but at some point they just drew the line and said, that's it. You have to choose. You're with us, the Christians, the Catholics, or you're with the Jews, or you can be somewhere else. But, you can't be Jew and Catholic, but that's where in the 2nd century somewhere. Throughout the 1st century, Jesus has been crucified. He has been resurrected. He's ascended into heaven. The church has begun. Pentecost has happened. Peter is ruling the church. And I think before the 1st century is out, he's been succeeded by Linus and Cletus, Anacletus, Clement, and so forth. And all of this has gone on while the church really could be properly said to subsist within the Jewish nation, religion, culture, everything, the synagogue, temple, all of that. Well, until the temple was destroyed. You see, the Jews or the Christians really were partially subsisting in there. Now, the Christians that were converted from outside that area, they get baptized, they're directly in the faith. They don't need to become Jews. They probably was even somewhat discouraged. But if somebody were to say, start with nothing as just a pagan of some sort, and maybe they learn the Jewish stuff and they get circumcised and they go with that for a season, and then maybe they learn about Christ and they get baptized, that was a pretty nice thing. Problem with that was some people would get kind of feeling superior. I've been the whole rank. I've got a piece of all of God's covenants in me. And it got to a point that that's probably one of the reasons that the church had to say, no, that does not give you any different or special standing in the kingdom of God. The only ones that actually count is what you have in the Catholic Church, that you may in your past have been a Jew, or even if, let's say, in the congregation of St. James and the like, you are continuing as a practicing Jew, is not really relevant to your relationship to the church. Because being a patriotic American citizen who always votes and serves on juries and does all those other specifically patriotic duties or not, does not really affect whether you're a Catholic. You're an American citizen, you have these obligations, paying your taxes and all the rest of it. You're not, these don't exist for you, but whatever country you might belong to would carry some equivalent obligations or not, whatever the country does. But that's separate. So you have you had a period of time where there was an overlap between the Christian congregation and the Jewish congregation. And you could belong to just one if you're only a Jew but not a Christian, or just the other as a Christian who's never been circumcised, or as both, like say the Apostle Paul. He was circumcised, and then on the road to Damascus, he realized he needed to become a Christian, and then he was baptized. So he really is in effect both. Are you a Jew? I am more so, he says in one of his letters. Are you this? I am that too. I want to be all things to all men. And I am all things to all men. That was Paul's position. And he had that place that he could do that. So he could use his Jewish background as an evangelical basis for things that could help. But it didn't mean that gave him any standing in the kingdom of God. So again, we have a society that looks quasi-religious. It's not really, because it's really a secular society with a state religion. But as members of that society, which every Catholic or virtually every Catholic would have been a member of at the outset of the situation, obviously the bare fact of being a member does not of itself deprive a person of the status of being a Catholic. But as time goes on and it's got the state religion going, and this state religion distances itself from the Catholic faith step by step by step, by invalidating their sacraments, by creating a fake new mass, by putting out weird new catechisms that are very bizarre, by just all the other crazy stuff they're doing. At some point, like I said, the real sheep will not continue to listen to the stranger's voice. And they will stick with the true shepherd's voice. And in time, they would either have to leave just to preserve their own spiritual sanity, or be put out because their Catholicism just can't be tolerated by those of the new religion who were in all this power that they had. And that's where you start getting not just individual faithful, but various faithful priests, and ultimately even some faithful bishops who continued the traditional Catholic Church. Now, once you got that, you just follow the line of the Catholic Church from there, and it follows a very clean and legally continuous chain of command all the way from those earliest days throughout that time, clear to the traditionalists today.
Well said. And again, anyone who likes this show or likes the series of shows, like, share, and subscribe, comment, tell us what you like. And actually, it's a really good thing. If you have any questions for Mr. Ruby, send them to me on Twitter. You can find me at Kevy Gillikin. That's KEVVYGILLIKIN. Or email them to me at kevin89davis@gmail.com. Maybe we can do that on a kind of a last segment, maybe or even a whole new show. I don't know. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of questions. Go ahead and send them to me, and I'll hit them up. And I think I appreciate that about you, Mr. Ruby, that you're willing to answer questions and you're willing to be open and honest about this stuff. And I'm sorry, some of these people that have issues with this show, I just don't feel like they're being open, that they're not willing to come on and not willing to discuss this stuff. Then tough. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, we're trying to find solutions. Not everyone has the answers, but I think it's good to talk about it. And I appreciate having you on. I hope that you have a good rest of your vacation, and maybe we'll talk again while you're on vacation. We'll have to find out if we get a time that works for both of us. But there is a part 4 coming out, and then maybe we'll do a part 5 answering frequently asked questions, but we'll see as we go. Maybe there'll be a part 4.5. I don't really know. We'll see. We're kind of winging it as we go. But as always, Mr. Ruby, I really appreciate it. And again, enjoy your vacation. I hope to see you soon.
Okay. Well, it's been great being on here, and I appreciate your willingness to do this. Okay. Well.
All right. God bless.
Good day and God bless.